You wake up in a world where every breath you take, every step you make, every word you speak is dictated by rules so bizarre and absolute that breaking even the smallest one could cost you your life. You're surrounded by luxury beyond imagination, silk cushions worth more than entire villages, walls adorned with precious gems that catch the light like captured stars, fountains flowing with rose water that costs more than gold. But this paradise is also your prison, and the golden chains that bind you are forged from rules so strange, so unforgiving, that they would make a modern person's head spin with disbelief. Welcome to the ancient world of imperial harems, where power and paranoia created some of the most shocking regulations in human history. These weren't just guidelines, they were laws written in blood, enforced by death, and designed to control every aspect of human existence within those marble walls. Today, we're going to explore the most unbelievable rules that govern these hidden worlds, rules so extreme that they reveal the terrifying lengths to which absolute power will go to maintain control. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The first rule that would absolutely shatter your modern understanding of personal freedom was the rule of absolute silence. In the Ottoman imperial harem, there were designated hours, sometimes entire days, when no one was allowed to speak above a whisper. But here's where it gets truly insane. During the Sultan's meditation periods, which could last anywhere from 3 to 12 hours, the penalty for making any sound louder than a falling feather was immediate execution, not exile, not imprisonment, death. Imagine living in a world where coughing at the wrong moment could end your life. Women would develop elaborate hand signals, facial expressions, and body language so complex that it rivaled the most sophisticated sign languages ever created. They had different gestures for everything, requesting food, expressing illness, even indicating romantic interest. The most skilled women could conduct entire conversations through nothing but the positioning of their fingers and the tilt of their heads. But the silence rule had a darker purpose than just maintaining tranquility. It was designed to prevent conspiracies, to stop the formation of alliances that might threaten the ruler's power. When people can't speak freely, they can't organize rebellion. The architects of these rules understood something terrifying about human nature, that silence breeds isolation, and isolation breeds submission. Even more bizarre was the rule of invisible existence. In certain Chinese imperial harems, there were women known as the shadowless ones, concubines who were forbidden from casting shadows in the emperor's presence. This wasn't just poetic language, it was enforced through brutal practicality. These women were required to position themselves in such specific ways that their shadows would never fall across the emperor's path or onto any surface he might look upon. The logistics were mind-bending. Palace architects designed special chambers with mirrors and reflective surfaces, positioned at precise angles to eliminate shadows. Women spent hours each day practicing how to move, how to stand, how to exist without leaving any trace of their physical presence in the world. Some would press themselves against walls, contort their bodies into impossible positions, or time their movements with the sun's path across the sky, all to avoid the crime of existing too boldly in their ruler's presence. This rule created a psychological torture that's almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine being told that your very existence, the basic fact that you take up space in the world, is offensive to someone else. These women weren't just physically erased, they were psychologically trained to erase themselves. They learned to think of their own bodies as intrusions, their own presence as a violation of natural order. But perhaps the most shocking rule of all was the purity of vision decree found in several ancient Persian harems. Under this rule, no woman was allowed to look directly at any man except the ruler himself. This included fathers, brothers, sons, and even male infants. The penalty for accidentally making eye contact with a forbidden man wasn't just punishment for the woman, it was death for the man as well. The enforcement of this rule created a surveillance state within the harem that would make modern authoritarian regimes look amateur. There were women whose sole job was to watch other women's eyes, to track where they looked, to report any infractions. These eye watchers were given special privileges, better food, private chambers, silk clothing, in exchange for their constant vigilance over their sisters' gazes. The psychological impact was devastating. Women learned to navigate the world through peripheral vision, to develop an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings without ever looking directly at anything. They would walk through corridors with their eyes fixed on specific patterns in the floor tiles, memorizing every crack and stain so they could move safely through their world without risking forbidden sight. Some women went blind from the stress of constantly controlling their vision. Others developed nervous tics, unable to stop their eyes from darting around in search of safe places to look. The rule didn't just control their bodies, it rewired their brains, teaching them to experience the world as a dangerous place where even the most basic human instinct of looking around could trigger catastrophe. The rule of measured breathing takes us into even stranger territory. In certain Indian royal harems, women were required to breathe in specific patterns depending on the time of day, the season, and the ruler's mood. There were different breathing rhythms for morning, afternoon, and evening. Special patterns for festivals, for mourning periods, for times of war. The most complex breathing sequences had over 40 different phases, each time to the second, each failure punishable by days of starvation. Palace physicians would monitor the women's breathing using primitive but effective methods, placing feathers near their nostrils to watch for irregularities, timing their chest movements with water clocks, even listening to their sleep breathing through thin walls. The idea was that controlled breathing would create controlled thoughts, that by regulating the most basic life function, they could regulate the mind itself. Women would spend hours each day practicing their assigned breathing patterns, using beads and counting systems to maintain perfect rhythm. Some became so obsessed with breathing correctly that they developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. They would wake up in the middle of the night in panic, convinced they had been breathing wrong in their sleep. Others learned to breathe so quietly and precisely that they seemed almost ghost-like, their presence barely registering even to trained observers. The rule of fragrant hierarchy might sound almost quaint compared to these others, but its implementation was anything but gentle. In Byzantine imperial harems, every woman was assigned a specific scent based on her rank and relationship to the emperor. The higher your status, the more complex and expensive your required fragrance. But here's the twist that makes this rule truly diabolical. If you were caught wearing a scent above your station, the punishment was to have your sense of smell permanently destroyed through chemical burning of the nasal passages. The scent assignments weren't random. They were carefully calculated to create a complex social hierarchy that could be navigated through smell alone. The emperor could walk into any room and immediately know the status of every woman present just by breathing. Lower-ranking women might wear simple lavender or mint, while favorites could wear combinations of rare spices, exotic flowers, and precious oils that took months to prepare. But the system created its own form of torture through temptation. Women would spend their lives surrounded by beautiful, expensive fragrances that they were forbidden to wear. Some would sneak tiny amounts of higher status scents onto their skin, knowing that discovery meant mutilation, but unable to resist the psychological pull of smelling like someone more important, more valued, more human. The enforcement required teams of women with trained noses who could detect even the slightest scent violation. These fragrance guards would patrol the halls, sniffing the air, checking skin and clothing for unauthorized odors. They carried small vials of the chemical compounds used for punishment, ready to destroy a woman's sense of smell at the first sign of olfactory rebellion. Perhaps most disturbing was how these women began to lose their own natural scent identity. After years of wearing assigned fragrances, many couldn't remember what they had smelled like before entering the harem. Their natural body chemistry adapted to the imposed scents, creating a kind of chemical Stockholm syndrome where they became psychologically dependent on their assigned smell to feel like themselves. The rule of silent feet prohibited women from making any sound while walking. Not just quiet walking, completely silent movement across marble floors, wooden boards, gravel paths, and even grass. Women would spend years learning to distribute their weight, to time their steps with ambient sounds, to move like ghosts through their golden prison. But we've only scratched the surface of these unbelievable regulations. The rules governing sleep, eating, bathing, and even the direction women could face while sitting reveal a level of control so absolute, so invasive, that it challenges everything we think we know about human dignity and freedom. What we've explored so far represents just the beginning of a system designed to transform human beings into living dolls, beautiful objects whose every breath served the pleasure and paranoia of absolute power. The rule of directional existence dictated that women could only face certain compass directions depending on their rank and the time of day. In some Mughal harems, lower-ranking concubines were forbidden from facing east during sunrise hours, as this was considered the sacred direction of new beginnings, a privilege reserved only for the emperor's most favored wives. Women would carry small compass devices hidden in their jewelry, constantly checking their orientation to avoid accidentally positioning themselves in forbidden directions. The complexity of this rule defied rational understanding. Palace floors were marked with subtle patterns and symbols that indicated proper positioning for different times and seasons. Women learned to read these markings like a navigation system, always aware of their spatial relationship to invisible lines of power and prohibition. Some would develop such acute directional awareness that they could sense magnetic north even in windowless chambers deep within the palace complex. Violations weren't immediately punished. Instead, infractions were recorded by direction keepers who maintained detailed logs of every woman's positioning throughout the day. At the end of each month, those with the most violations would face collective punishment that could include weeks of forced standing in uncomfortable positions or being locked in chambers where only the most psychologically distressing directions were allowed. The rule of liquid consumption controlled not just what women drank, but how they drank it. In certain Arabian royal harems, the angle at which a woman tilted her head while drinking water was strictly regulated based on her menstrual cycle, the phase of the moon, and her current favor with the ruler. There were 47 different prescribed drinking angles, each with its own meaning and social significance. Palace servants called water watchers would observe every sip, noting the precise angle of head tilt, the duration of each swallow, and the rhythm of breathing between drinks. Women who consistently demonstrated perfect drinking form could earn privileges like flavored water or the right to drink from vessels made of precious metals. Those who failed were given increasingly bitter and unpleasant liquids until their technique improved. The psychological pressure was immense. Something as basic as quenching thirst became a performance art requiring constant concentration and perfect muscle memory. Women would practice drinking movements for hours, using mirrors to perfect their angles, developing neck and jaw muscles specifically to maintain the demanding positions required by their assigned drinking protocols. The rule of dream direction went beyond controlling waking hours. It attempted to regulate sleep itself. In some Chinese imperial harems, women were required to sleep with their heads pointing towards specific directions based on their astrological signs and their relationship to the emperor. But the rule went further. They were expected to control the direction they faced in their dreams. Palace dream interpreters would question women each morning about the content and direction of their dreams. Those who reported dreaming while facing forbidden directions would be given sleeping potions designed to create nightmares, teaching their unconscious minds to avoid psychological territories deemed inappropriate for their station. Some women learned to lie about their dreams, creating elaborate fictional dream narratives that satisfied the interpreters while protecting their private mental lives. The enforcement of dream direction created a form of psychological warfare against the subconscious mind. Women would go to bed in terror, knowing that their sleeping minds might betray them, might wander into forbidden mental territories that could result in punishment. Many developed severe insomnia, afraid to enter the vulnerable state of sleep, where their thoughts might escape conscious control. The rule of emotional seasons dictated that women could only experience certain emotions during specific times of the year. Joy was permitted only during designated celebration periods. Sadness was allowed during mourning seasons. Anger was forbidden entirely, except for a single day each year when it could be expressed, but only through prescribed physical movements that transformed rage into dance-like performances. Emotion monitors were trained to detect subtle signs of inappropriate feelings, changes in breathing patterns, micro-expressions, alterations in posture that might indicate forbidden emotional states. These monitors themselves had to maintain perfect emotional neutrality at all times, creating a class of women who had trained themselves into psychological numbness to serve the system. Women developed elaborate internal emotional regulation techniques, learning to suppress natural reactions and manufacture appropriate feelings on demand. Some became so skilled at emotional control that they lost touch with their genuine feelings entirely, becoming living actresses who could no longer distinguish between performance and authentic experience. Others would secretly experience forbidden emotions in hidden parts of the palace, stealing moments of genuine human feeling, like forbidden fruit. The rule of mathematical beauty required women to maintain body proportions that matched specific geometric ratios considered perfect by palace mathematicians. Every month, women would be measured with precision instruments, the distance between their eyes, the curve of their waists, the length of their fingers, all recorded and compared to ideal mathematical formulas. Those whose measurements deviated from the prescribed ratios would be subjected to gradual physical modification programs, special diets to adjust weight distribution, exercises designed to elongate or shorten specific body parts, even primitive surgical procedures to reshape features that didn't conform to the mathematical ideals. The goal wasn't just physical beauty, it was the transformation of human bodies into living geometric perfection. Women would spend hours each day performing specific exercises designed to maintain their assigned proportions. They used measuring strings and calculation devices to monitor their own bodies, becoming obsessed with tiny changes that might indicate mathematical deviation. The psychological pressure to conform to numerical perfection created body dysmorphia so severe that some women could no longer see their own reflections without immediately calculating ratios and angles. The rule of synchronized existence demanded that groups of women move, breathe, and even blink in perfect unison during certain palace ceremonies. This wasn't just choreographed performance, it was mandatory biological synchronization that required months of training to achieve. Women would practice for hours, learning to suppress their individual rhythms and merge into collective patterns of movement and breath. Synchronization masters would use drums, bells, and other timing devices to train groups of women to function as single organisms. Those who couldn't maintain perfect synchrony would be isolated from the group and subjected to individual training so intensive that it often resulted in psychological breakdown. The goal was to eliminate individual identity entirely during these collective performances, creating human machines that operated with mechanical precision. The training process was brutal and dehumanizing. Women would be forced to suppress natural reflexes, ignore physical discomfort, and subordinate their individual biological rhythms to the collective pattern. Some developed nervous system disorders from the constant suppression of natural responses. Others lost the ability to function independently, becoming so dependent on group synchronization that they couldn't perform basic tasks without external timing cues. These rules weren't arbitrary cruelties. They were systematic methods of breaking down individual identity and rebuilding human beings as perfect servants of absolute power. Every regulation, no matter how bizarre it seemed, served the dual purpose of demonstrating the ruler's complete control while ensuring that no woman retained enough individual agency to pose a threat to the established order. The women who survived these systems did so by developing psychological strategies that allowed them to preserve some core of themselves while appearing to comply completely with the impossible demands placed upon them. But survival came at a cost that echoed through generations, creating trauma patterns that affected not just the women themselves, but the children born within these walls of beautiful tyranny. The rule of memory. Erasure represents perhaps the most chilling attempt at psychological control ever devised. In certain Mesopotamian royal harems, women were forbidden from speaking about their lives before entering the palace. But this wasn't simply a rule against reminiscing. It was systematic elimination of personal history. Women caught mentioning their families, their childhood homes, or even their original names would face what was called the forgetting cure. This cure involved a combination of herbal compounds that affected memory formation, sleep deprivation techniques that confused temporal awareness, and psychological conditioning that made accessing old memories physically painful. Memory keepers would question women regularly, probing for any signs that they retained connections to their former lives. Those who showed too much attachment to their past would be subjected to increasingly intense treatments until their pre-harem memories became inaccessible. The process created women who existed in a permanent present tense, unable to draw strength from their origins or maintain hope based on memories of freedom. Some would develop false memories implanted by the memory keepers, fictional histories that made their servitude seem natural and chosen rather than imposed. Others would cling desperately to tiny fragments of genuine memory, hiding them like precious gems in the deepest corners of their minds. The rule of liquid tears controlled even the most basic human expression of emotion. In some Byzantine harems, women were assigned specific tear quotas based on their rank and current status. Lower-ranking concubines were required to cry exactly 7 tears per day, not 6, not 8, while higher-ranking wives might be forbidden from crying at all, except during designated mourning periods. Tear counters would observe women throughout the day, using small glass vessels to collect and measure emotional discharge. The tears had to fall at appropriate times and in appropriate amounts. Crying too little suggested dangerous emotional control that might indicate rebellion. Crying too much implied weakness that could reflect poorly on the ruler's selection process. The perfect amount of tears demonstrated proper feminine sensitivity without crossing into threatening emotional territory. Women learned to manufacture tears on command, using techniques ranging from onion powder hidden in their clothing to psychological manipulation of their own memories. Some became so skilled at tear production that they could cry specific amounts at will, turning their emotional responses into a form of performance art. Others lost the ability to cry naturally, their tear ducts becoming as controlled and artificial as everything else in their manufactured lives. The rule of nutritional hierarchy dictated that women could only consume foods that matched their current emotional state, as determined by palace officials. A woman designated as melancholy could only eat bitter foods, herbs, unsweetened gruel, vinegar-based broths. Those classified as joyful were restricted to sweet items that would maintain their assigned happiness. Angry women received spicy foods designed to channel their rage into digestible form. Dietary assessors would taste test every meal before it reached the women, ensuring that the flavor profiles matched the prescribed emotional categories. The meals themselves became forms of psychological conditioning, training women's bodies to associate certain feelings with specific tastes. Over time, this created Pavlovian responses, where women would begin experiencing the assigned emotions simply from smelling their designated foods. The nutritional restrictions often led to severe health problems, as women's bodies were denied the balanced nutrition necessary for physical well-being. But maintaining health was less important than maintaining emotional control. Women who showed signs of malnutrition that interfered with their assigned emotional states would receive medical attention, but those who remained properly conditioned were allowed to waste away as long as their feelings remained appropriately regulated. The rule of weighted walking required women to carry invisible burdens, precisely calculated amounts of weight distributed across their bodies in ways that couldn't be detected by casual observation. The weights were sewn into clothing, embedded in jewelry, and attached to undergarments in patterns designed to modify posture, gait, and even breathing patterns. Weight masters would adjust these burdens daily based on a woman's current status and behavior. Those who pleased their supervisors might have weights reduced, allowing them to move more freely and gracefully. Those who showed signs of independence or rebellion would find their burdens increased until every step became a conscious effort requiring complete focus and submission. The psychological impact went far beyond physical discomfort. Women learned to associate freedom of movement with reward and restriction of movement with punishment. Their bodies became constant reminders of their status within the hierarchy, with every gesture and step reflecting their current level of favor or disgrace. Some developed such strong psychological associations with their weights that they felt physically unbalanced and anxious when the burdens were temporarily removed. The rule of vocal octaves assigned each woman a specific pitch range in which she was allowed to speak. These ranges were determined by complex calculations involving the woman's height, age, astrological sign, and relationship to the ruler. Speaking outside one's assigned octave range, even accidentally, was considered a form of vocal rebellion that could result in temporary or permanent damage to the vocal cords. Voice trainers worked with women for hours each day, using primitive but effective instruments to measure pitch and ensure compliance with octave assignments. The training was rigorous and often painful, requiring women to strain their vocal cords into unnatural positions to maintain the required pitch ranges. Some women's voices became permanently altered by this training, creating artificial-sounding speech patterns that marked them forever as products of the harem system. The octave assignments weren't random. They were designed to prevent certain types of communication. Lower pitches that might carry authority or command were reserved for only the highest-ranking women. Higher pitches that might convey vulnerability or need for protection were assigned to those meant to appear childlike and dependent. The middle ranges that allowed for normal conversational tone were forbidden to most women, forcing them to speak in ways that constantly reminded them and others of their artificial status. These unbelievable rules reveal the horrifying extremes of absolute power, systems designed not just to control bodies, but to reshape human consciousness itself. From silent footsteps to regulated tears, from invisible shadows to mathematical beauty, these regulations transformed women into living instruments of imperial will. Their stories remind us that behind every golden palace lay foundations built on the systematic destruction of human dignity, and that the price of absolute power has always been paid by those who had no choice in the matter.